This is Special Prosecutor Larry Klayman.
I'm the only lawyer ever to obtain a court ruling that a president of the United States committed a crime.
For truth. For competition.
As a young lawyer, I helped break up AT&T. That's why you have all your cell phones today.
For sovereignty. For the Republic.
I'm the guy who at Judicial Watch, which I founded, uncovered the Chinagate scandal. Millions of dollars going to the Clinton campaign, corrupting our political system.
For the privacy of citizens.
And I'm the only guy to have enjoined the National Security Agency from mass surveillance on hundreds of millions of Americans.
Tearing it up.
I'm the son of meatpackers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I know how to slice and dice.
Bringing it back.
We're going to take this country apart and put it back together again in the way envisioned by our founding fathers.
It's not just talk.
We're not just regurgitating news stories. Larry Klayman, special prosecutor, is making the news.
And now, here's Larry.
Welcome to this week's edition of Special Prosecutor with Larry Klayman. We have a very special show. I have our guest and friend, Stephen GREER. He's the world's most foremost expert, for lack of a better way of describing him, on unidentified flying saucers and related issues. I'm choking up because this is a very crucial issue right now with regard to this country, with the world, and the universe. It's coming out more and more, and now is the time for Stephen to tell the story, and he's the one who knows it the best. But before I do that, I just wanted to announce that early next week, on Tuesday of the following week, we're going to be releasing our Citizens Grand Jury, where we indicted Robert Mueller. We talked about that in last week's show. We've had a tremendous response in terms of who listened to that show. But I want you to be able to watch how we did that, how the people have the power to bring about justice in their own hands, how we're doing it peacefully and legally, and how we cannot rely on our government to do it. And that's, of course, one of the stories that Stephen GREER is going to be telling today, how the government has not told us the truth about unidentified flying objects and such related issues and that matter. But before we do that, Stephen, I want you to get into your background so people understand who you are. You have such a distinguished and learned background. I met you several months ago at the debut of your film, Unacknowledged, which is also a book. It's a great book and film, but it's about time that our audience gets to know what you do, because it's such an important subject for today's world.
Well, thank you. I'm really honored to be on the show with you. I'm actually an emergency doctor. I'm an ER doc and trauma guy who is connected to the aerospace industry. My mother's brother, my uncle, helped design the lunar module, which is a funny-looking thing. It looks like a spider. It landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong in 1969. And when I was a very young guy, I learned about this issue and then actually had a sighting of similar to what you're seeing on Fox News and other news outlets this week. That's a metallic disc-shaped object with no seams, windows, etc. It hovered and then vanished at an enormous rate of speed. And so I took a great interest in this, but my background is science, medicine, and physics. And I started in 2000, a little before the year 2000, a project called the Disclosure Project, which between 1990 and 2000, I had identified about 110 military and corporate whistleblowers who knew about unconstitutional and illegal operations in the U.S. government dealing with this subject. Initially, to be honest, I didn't understand what the big deal was because, I thought, well, a lot of people have seen these objects, so what? And it turned out that there was I think the common parlance today would be deep state, but the proper term, just so your audience gets educated on this, is an unacknowledged special access project. So what does that mean? A special access project is one that's highly compartmented intelligence, usually top secret, SCI, special compartmented information. But an unacknowledged SAP, a USAP, those are the ones that are off the books, being run illegally. And when I first learned of this, it was actually back, ironically, you mentioned the Clinton administration. I was asked to do a briefing for the first CIA director for Bill Clinton in 1993, which is the year he was inaugurated, of course, because he and the president had made inquiries into this subject and had been denied access. So when I first did not believe that was true, I thought, well, the spy master is asking me to come up to D.C. And I left my emergency department post, and I collected all this evidence and files and documents and stuff. And it turned out, in fact, he had been denied access. And then, a couple years later, I'm briefing the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Tom Wilson. Now, there was just a big leak in the past 2 weeks of the notes that he had given and made with a aerospace researcher who worked for Bigelow Aerospace. At the time, it was the Bigelow's other company who was out in Las Vegas. And Admiral Wilson asked me to come do a stand-up briefing. And I brought astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon, and then my military advisor and one of Eisenhower's young guys who worked with him who knew about this subject in the 50s and so on. Well, it turned out that Admiral Wilson, I had sent him a brief, a document prior to the meeting, and he had inquired into some of the compartments and operations dealing with this that were named in this document I had acquired from so-called Area 51, Nellis Air Force Base. Well, he found people who worked in these USAFs, and they basically said to him, now, I want your audience to listen. This is the head of intelligence, J2, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States of America. And they said, sir, you don't have a need to know, and we're not going to read you into this. And they basically pushed him aside. He was furious. So by the time I got to the briefing, you can imagine it was a very difficult meeting. He was terrified. He realized there was an illegal, unconstitutional, corrupt enterprise deeply embedded in the U.S. government, corporate, military, and intelligence. And most of our great military and intelligence officers are actually victims of this group. So it's a complex story. I know we don't have a lot of time, but that's sort of how I got to be where I am now. I left my medical career because I realized, my mother's family, we were the first, some say losers, who got captured by the British in the American Revolution and were thrown in prison right away in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Dutch. And I go, you know what? This country is in greater peril than people realize. And I'm an emergency doctor. I tell people I know an emergency when I see one. We are in a really deep hole in terms of the rule of law and the overreaching of the national security state, not legitimate security. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things that are outrageous. And people say, why would all that happen? I said, back in the 50s, they figured out how these things operate. And they realized we wouldn't need oil or gas or coal. The bottom line is that the gangbangsters and the big transnational corporations working with classified projects have kept this secret because the ultimate libertarian freedom act would be that everyone in the world would not have to be dependent on oil coming out of the Middle East or what have you, and there would be energy independence, not just from what we're doing in America from fossil fuels, but that everyone would have let's call it a electronic device that would pull energy out of what's called the 0-point energy field. Now, I know this isn't a physics group on your show, so I'm not going to get into the arcana of that except to explain that if you took the volume of space in your coffee cup, there is enough potential power in that much space-time that's in this 0-point energy field to boil off all the oceans of the world.
Stephen, how did we learn about this? What was the point that these secret projects got underway? Where did we learn about these secret energy sources? I take it was through
it actually goes back long before what people think of in terms of the modern UFO era of Roswell and Area 51 and all those cliches, and we can talk about that. Some of that's true, some isn't. It started back in the early part of the 20th century, maybe late 1800s, and geniuses like Maxwell and Faraday and also, of course, Nikola Tesla. And Nikola Tesla had stumbled across this effect, and J.P. Morgan turned to him and said, look, if I can't put a meter on it, you're not going to bring it out. And so it's a typical sort of big money trumping freedom of science and ideas. And as a scientist, I've seen this happen over and over and over again.
Is what you're talking about anti-gravitational technology?
Well, there's two things. One is the energy source itself. The other is when you configure it into sort of rotational vortexes that causes what's called anti-gravity, where you see these objects. If you look at the Fox News segment of how that thing was moving and stopping, because you can control for zero mass. Basically, you have what's called gravity control. Now, pop culture would call that anti-gravity. It's really a misnomer. The proper term would be gravity control. But we attained that in October of 1954. So that has been classified way beyond normal top secret SAPs, special access projects, into these USAPs. And Eisenhower, as you know, who was, five-star general and the World War II hero, but, he ended up being pushed aside by a deep state clique of people who wanted to aggregate this power for themselves. And this is why Eisenhower made that very famous speech of wearing the military-industrial complex. He wasn't talking about the normal military intelligence corporate world. He was talking about this stuff, but he didn't want to reference it. People who worked with him, who subsequently were on my team, and some of these 110 top secret people who have come forward, that number is now 950 people that we have who work inside these projects. They said, there's one man who was at the briefing at the Pentagon with Admiral Wilson and myself. He said, Eisenhower was very depressed and very upset because this group had seized the reins out of the constitutional oversight and control. And so, my friend, it has been like that since the late 1950s.
We're going to come to the next segment, Steve, but I want you to explain how Roswell figures into this, the crash of the UFO there in Area 51. We're going to be back in about 30 seconds. Until then, I'd like people to go to freedomwatchusa.org. I'm going to link Stephen's website and his book. And if they want to get a DVD copy, we'll figure out later in the show how they can do that, because it's a great, great story. But we're going to be right back with more from Stephen GREER, Energy UFOs.
Dangerous.
Don't care. Use the court and the law.
Lethal.
This is bad.
Special prosecutor.
Very bad.
Larry Klayman.
If you'd like to support Freedom Watch and this radio show, go to freedomwatchusa.org.
I'm back with Stephen GREER, and I want to continue the story about these energy sources and factor it into what happened at Roswell and Area 51. By the way, we'll talk about it later, but I 8 years ago, filed a Freedom of Information Act request for this information. Only 8 years later did I get anything, and 90% of it was in Russian. We're going to talk about that. But, Steve, go on with what you were telling the audience.
Yeah, so I think that if you look at the history of this, during World War II, there were these objects that were called Foo Fighters. Yes, that's a rock group, and they named their band after all this when we brought it out. The Foo Fighters are what the military called these objects that were zipping around our aircraft in the European theater in World War II. They didn't know what they were. General Jimmy Doolittle was sent over to the European theater of operations. His nephew's on my team, is also a medical doctor like myself, and was asked by Roosevelt, what are these things? And he came back into the White House and said, these are interplanetary vehicles. I'm quoting. So we have known about this for a great deal of time, but they didn't understand what they were, why they were here. By the time we started detonating atomic bombs, apparently a big red flag went out over the planet, and there were a huge number of these interplanetary vehicles that were tracked, and they were over all of our nuclear test sites and facilities because they obviously thought we were going to destroy the whole planet and ourselves with it, which we could have, and still could, if the fools blow it up. Now, unfortunately, what happened in the interim in the 40s and up to the late 40s is that we developed electronic weapon systems that were embedded in radar systems. And I have an FBI memo. It's the most viewed document on the FBI website, and it's a memo from a field agent, Guy Hottel, Hottel, to J. Edgar Hoover, where he's describing the crash at Roswell where these discs were retrieved, and he said he had learned that it was because we had a special quote-unquote radar system that was switched on that caused these craft to be, because they're totally electronic, to malfunction and collide into each other. And that is substantially correct. That is an official FBI document, and it's in the movie Unacknowledged, and it's in the book Unacknowledged, and it is authentic, and it's on the FBI website. The point I'm making is they didn't travel interstellar distances and just couldn't navigate through New Mexico. They were actually downed with an electronic warfare system, although an early one. And the euphemism that is we often use in the military for this is a, quote, radar, but you'll have a electronic warfare system piggybacked in a conventional radar array, and that's what happened at Roswell in 1947. It turns out there were 3 craft that were disabled and crashed. One was blown to smithereens, very few pieces left. One continued westward near Socorro and was broken but mostly intact, and there was one ET life form that lived, and I've interviewed men before they passed away in the 90s who had actually handled that body. And then the third one wasn't found until 51 or 52 in a really remote area in northern western New Mexico, because that area was so sparsely populated then, and they didn't retrieve it till later. So that's how that started. We then began an R&D program that was headed up by Edward Teller and Dr. Vannevar Bush. Bush had put together, no relation to the Bush political family, the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb, and they started a very top-secret group to study the quote-unquote modus operandi, the technology behind how these objects could be functioning. And that began in really big time in the 40s and early 50s. And subsequently, then the Nevada Test Range, which is Nellis Air Force Base, and there's an area on the grid that's Area 51, that's the way it's called that, where you have Pahut Mesa, S4, S9, S12, that are very classified areas where a lot of this research and development was going on. It was also going on at various corporate facilities like at EG&G. Los Alamos was involved, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which at the time was the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force, in the late 40s after the Air Force was formed. Interestingly, both the CIA and was born out of the OSS, and the Air Force was created off the Army Air Force after this event happened in New Mexico in 1947.
Steve, when we come back, I want to discuss the bodies, of these aliens, what happened to them, and take it from that point forward. We're going to be right back with the third and longest segment of Special Prosecutor with Larry Klayman.
And now, 4 words that make corrupt politicians make wee-wee in their little pants.
Transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstones of this presidency.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Special Prosecutor Larry Klayman.
Be the one who makes our country great again. Go to freedomwatchusa.org and donate.
Steve, continue with this story. I mean, there were 3 craft. A couple of them were destroyed, in effect. I take it they were reverse engineered. That's what you're talking about, by our military in these deep secret places in and around Area 51 and elsewhere. But there were also bodies involved, weren't there? What happened to them?
Well, they were deceased except for one. One lived until 51 or 52 in captivity and was interrogated. They're short. They don't look like the caricatures you see. No hair, highly intelligent. My estimate on IQ is 400 to 500 if we had the scale that went that high. Quite advanced, certainly thousands, if not millions of years more advanced than we are technologically, which first begs the question, are they hostile? And the answer is certainly not. They're actually worried about our hostility and with the problems we have on this planet. and that being put out into space where we export that same warlike aggression into space. And that's why when the atomic era and the nuclear bomb era started, that's why there was a huge involvement, and it's been mismanaged for 70 years. But the bodies themselves are, have no hair. Actually, they show the bug eyes. They're not like that. Those are covers. The actual eyes look kind of like deer-like. They have no external ears, or what we call pinna, the flap of the ear, the monkey, chimpanzee ears we have. They don't have those. They just have openings. And they have a unitary organ in the chest that's a heart-lung combined organ as opposed to hearts and lungs. I mean, there's different physiology. I know people who, when the bodies were actually autopsied, who had notes that have been leaked to us. And, I have a massive archive on this from very legitimate inside sources. But now, that's just one species. There are actually several dozen species that are involved. There are different types of craft that have been seen. Some are triangular, some are spherical, some are disc-shaped, some look like a little bit like a domed, and some are like a bell. They're different shapes, and there are different planetary systems. They seem to all be cooperatively working in, this mission to planet Earth, because we seem to be a problem stepchild as we've gone from muskets to thermonuclear weapons. And there's some project that's observing and trying to keep track of what we're doing. I don't see any evidence that they're hostile. It seems that they're concerned about our hostility, and that often gets misinterpreted by classified programs because they haven't really initiated a proper line of communication. So that's one of the reasons why I think what I started, the Disclosure Project, and we had a big press conference in 2001 about this, that was covered globally. Around 800 million people saw it. And that launched the whole modern era of disclosure that has now begun to come and has led to these things being leaking out of the Pentagon that's been on the news lately on CNN and Washington Post, but with a spin. Unfortunately, these USATs, which are the deep state, have been spinning all of that in the direction of it being a threat. Because my understanding, what Werner von Braun, who, of course, invented the V-2 rocket for Adolf Hitler, said prior to his death in the mid to early 70s, was that these civilizations are no threat, but they're going to spin it that way for the benefit of these corrupt interests in the military-industrial corporate complex, what has currently been called this deep state of nefarious activities. So we've known that for many, many decades. And so the spin that you're seeing, that, they just had a briefing yesterday with Senate Intel committee members, the spin that they're doing is, yes, they're out there, but they're a threat to our sovereignty and national security. I think that's a lot of nonsense, because somebody's got to create another war, don't they?
Where do they come from? Did we find that out when they were interrogated? I mean, is there any hypothesis or actual knowledge as to where they emanate from?
Well, there's one civilization that's allegedly from the Zeta Reticuli star system. It's in our galaxy. There's another species that my group has gone out on reconnaissance and had that is from the Andromeda galaxy. We have a photo of one of these beings. We're actually working on a documentary about this, and all this will be in the documentary. It's at ce5film.com if you're wanting to see what we're working on. But so I think that, they're from a number of star systems. I don't know. I've heard, Aldebaran. There are different star systems mentioned. I'm not sure that information is accurate. I don't know if for security reasons they would want that particularly disclosed. What's interesting is that you have to think about, if they're real, and now the Pentagon's saying they are, and they're interstellar, which they are, how are they doing this? You cannot go, even at the speed of light. It is too slow at the speed of light to go from one of those star systems to here. I mean, even 1% of the way through our own galaxy is 1,000 light years. So at the speed of light, it would take 1,000 years to get there. You'd be dead. So we're dealing with really, really advanced physics that cross into what are called transdimensional physics. Again, everyone's going to fall asleep if I go into the physics of this, but it's fascinating stuff. But you're basically dropping out of linear space-time and it's a non-local where you're actually bypassing linearity. It's what Einstein called the spooky effect, where he would observe a particle being in two points in space at the same measurable time because of what's called non-locality and entanglement in quantum mechanics. So take that and do it on a macro scale with an entire spacecraft and everyone on it. You'll begin to understand what I'm talking about. Do they have
bases here? I mean, I've read something, and I've heard maybe underneath the ocean in California and elsewhere. I mean, do they have places that they just kind of rest when they're not out flying around, for lack of a better word?
Well, there's a pretty large base out near the rings of Saturn. I had a Lockheed Martin executive who was in charge of the Cassini probe where they picked that one up. It's in the hundreds of miles across in diameter. It's huge. There are places that are underneath the surface of the Earth and the oceans. For example, off of Guam, I just, in the last few months, have had a man who was on a Coast Guard vessel that was pulled in for mutual assist. Only 8 people on the vessel had a top-secret clearance. He was one of them, where they retrieved a 20 to 30-foot diameter disc that we had apparently disabled that had come up out of the Marianas Trench, the deepest point in the ocean. And it was strangely, I mean, these stories are so bizarre, you have to know they're true. It was in the ocean, disabled. We may have hit it with one of these electronic weapons, and it was caught in a Taiwan fishing vessel net, a huge net. And so Marines got in first on a chopper and boarded the vessel and kind of commanded it. They pulled in and to try to retrieve it, and it was a Coast Guard buoy ship, and they were able to use the cranes on the buoy that they usually hoist these 18,000-pound buoys out of the ocean and get this thing up on the Coast Guard vessel. It was so heavy, though, it almost tilted the vessel over like at 45 degrees. So they knew it weighed way more than 18,000 pounds. But so that's one area where there have been a lot seen. For the first President Bush, his science advisor told us about a facility apparently underwater off the northern coast of the United Kingdom, very deep in the ocean. So we know there are a few places like this that have been monitored, whether they are regular stable facilities or just temporarily where these objects are and where they're doing reconnaissance. That I don't know. There seems to be a consistent number out of the Marianas Trench, however.
Well, there's been speculation, among some, or at least trying to give an impression that some of these vehicles may be our own. They may be from our military. What about that?
Well, yes, I would say somewhere between 80 and 90% of the sightings people have in remote areas of the Southwest, outback of Australia, et cetera, are actually man-made, what are called EMGs, electromagnetic gravitic devices. These are disc-shaped craft that have master gravity control. They are made by us. Lockheed Martin Skunk Works is involved. Certainly Northrop Grumman has been, EG&G, SAIC, Booz Allen Hamilton. There are a few of these in these USAPs that are contractors that are in these deep USAPs that have been involved. Those have gone through several generations of evolution from when we did initial research back in the 40s and 50s to objects that are more developed now. But the only thing worse than admitting that there are ET objects out there is that some of these are our own that have not been disclosed to people like Admiral Wilson. Or I also briefed, you can Google this man, he was the General Patrick Hughes, 3-star general in charge of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He was the director. And so he asked me to come in and do a briefing for him. He had made inquiries into this subject and had been just ridiculed and shut down and was furious also. And you can imagine, my life has gone from trauma and emergency and shootings and stabbings to real trauma, dealing with this crazy upside down world of illegal operations that have victimized some of the great heroes of our country who are legitimate people in the military and in the CIA. So one of the things I tell people, you cannot, these sweeping conspiracy theories everyone in the CIA knows. Baloney. Everyone in the Pentagon's involved in some big cover-up. Nonsense. Most people, the compartmentalization of this intelligence is so tight. It's way past Q clearance. It's way past nuclear launch codes and stuff like that. And unfortunately, it's been run without any appropriate oversight by the people or the people's representatives. And that, my friend, is dangerous. That is an existential threat to our democracy, and that kind of secrecy is erosive to our way of life. That's what Eisenhower, who's one of my heroes, warned about as he left office in January of 1961.
And as you know, Steve, I received a response finally. I said that at the outset of this show. On March 26th of 2019, I asked in a FOIA request for any and all information involving extraterrestrial visits, UFO encounters, Area 51, the Roswell incident, extraterrestrial life and information regarding the United States, Great Britain, and the United Nations with regard to parapsychology and related matters. And I got back, and you've seen it, I sent it to our mutual friend, the great Hollywood screenwriter, David Marconi, this information. His girlfriend, Masha, is Russian, because most of it came back in Russian. It's only about 2.5 inches thick. It's inconceivable that that's the only information that the Defense Intelligence Agency has.
No, it's not. And here's the other problem. FOIA is a joke. What does a FOIA officer have access to that the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency or the director of the CIA wouldn't have access to? If I had personally face-to-face briefed a sitting CIA director, sitting members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, sitting director of Intelligence Joint Chiefs of Staff, and head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and many others, the head of the Ministry of Defense in Great Britain, Canada, Australia, none of these people have been read into what's going on. They have been deceived. The public have been deceived. So going through the, quote, legal system, no offense, I know you're an attorney, but going through the FOIA system, that stuff, you might as well use it as toilet paper.
Well, we've got to come up with a way to pry this out, and you and I are going to be discussing that legally.
Yes, we are.
But what is the motive here? We got about a minute left in this segment, and then we'll come to the verdict section. That'll be the verdict. Why is the government going to such extremes to keep this thing secret, particularly when other governments, acknowledge UFOs, but ours never really have, other than, a few dribs and drabs that have come out lately?
I'll tell you what it's about. It's about macroeconomic global power. You talk about the global elite. You bring out this information, it's going to really change the macroeconomic system.
We're going to be right back, Steve, with the final verdict segment. We're going to get right into this. Thanks.
Before he was a trial lawyer, he sliced him and diced him.
People used to ask me, Larry, what caused you to start Judicial Watch and now Freedom Watch, given the powerful forces in this country that put you at risk?
In a meat packing plant.
I'm the son of meat packers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I know how to slice and dice.
A very special prosecutor, Larry Klayman.
If you'd like to support Freedom Watch and this radio show, go to freedomwatchusa.org.
We're back with the verdict, and I was asking, why is it that Stephen GREER, the world's foremost expert on UFOs and related issues, the government has kept a secret all these years? Pick it up, Steve, because people need to understand. I understand it. I've been doing this for most of my career, just how dishonest the government is. But this is the capper in that regard.
Yeah, this is the biggest corrupt enterprise in the history of the United States government. And, in fact, I believe in the history of the world. And the motive behind it, if you go all the way back to when Paul Mellon, one of the few billionaires at the end of World War II, and some of his folks who were fascists, they were Nazi sympathizers up to the day we declared war. After the war, they took charge of this, were instrumental in forming a lot of the research and teams around this. And they wanted to keep it secret for a number of reasons. First, some of it was justified in the early days after World War II and then the Cold War, because we wanted to get an edge on the technological research on this. Then they realized, once they realized what they had, they realized that, well, goodbye ExxonMobil, or, Standard Oil and ExxonMobil. All the things that, Aramco in Saudi Arabia, you don't need those. And they realized that these technologies are so advanced that the petrodollar system and all the sort of global macroeconomic systems that are in place would have to be quite reformed. And now, mind you, this sort of technology would be the tide that lifted all ships, and would also, without having to have a bunch of tax and government schemes, solve all the pollution and environmental problems we have very quickly. But at the same time, you're talking about hundreds of trillions of dollars in assets that are in the balance here. So this is a macroeconomic and technological science story, much more about that than it is about these ET civilizations. They're not the problem. The problem is that we're incredibly dysfunctional right now as a civilization. We're sort of locked in a early 1900s, late 1800s technological paradigm with, our utilities and power generation and internal combustion engines. Those are, we're using the same things we were using in the late 1800s when Mercedes came up with those engines. And, a Tesla, you're plugging that into a power plant that's still centralized using nuclear or coal or oil. We don't need any of it. So the truth about this is that this would be an amazing revolution in science, technology, economy, poverty alleviation that would be right out of Atlas Shrugged or, Ayn Rand, in terms of it liberating people from the current system. The problem is your big stakeholders that are these global elite interests, they don't want that to happen, and they're the tail wagging the dog of the government of the United States. So this is where you get real money and real corruption at a scale, because forget about a few $1 billion. We're talking trillions.
No, we're going to be looking into that. I'm going to sit down with you in the next few weeks and come up with some kind of strategy here, Steve, so we can get to the bottom of it. But why is it, do you think, that our so-called government, I use that term loosely, is acknowledging it even in the slightest now? Is it just because there's so many sightings that they can't deny it, that we have military pilots that are citing it? Why is it that they won't come clean, given the fact that there is this leakage? And, of course, I understand.
There are actually fewer sightings now than there used to be because we put systems in place to target these objects that are more and more effective. I think that what's happening is that the disclosure project that I direct, and if you look at the documentary Unacknowledged, you were at the premiere and read that book. That documentary has now been seen by over 200 million people worldwide on black sites. It's on Netflix, it's on iTunes, and what's leaking out now isn't so much a leak; it's a controlled release. But as I said at the beginning, they're spinning it as a threat. You have Chris Mellon, who's a distant relative of Paul Mellon, going around saying they're violating our national sovereignty, trying to hit all the jingoistic, false patriotism, I call it.
We only have about 15 seconds. I'm going to bring you back, Steve, on this, and we're going to be working together. But where can they get your book, Unacknowledged, and where can they get the DVD of that? It's important people see that, or pick it up on Netflix or wherever.
Yeah, you can get it at Amazon. Also, you can see the documentary on Netflix and iTunes and download it digitally. And you can get the DVDs and a lot of the other material at our website, which is Sirius Disclosure, SIRIUS Disclosure.com. And there's a store there. It has all these books and DVDs and information. And there's a lot on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/SDisclosure, S as in Serious Disclosure.
Stephen, I want to thank you for what you do. Unfortunately, we're out of time right now, but this is just going to be the first, I hope, of many appearances. And it's not just fascinating, but this really deals with the history where we're going into the future. So thank you for everything you do. God bless you.